In this video, I will show how to create a custom MIDI map to control an OSC device with a MIDI controller using MIDI OSC Pro. Now in this example, I will create a MIDI map to automate the MOTU AVB audio interface. So if you haven't already, I recommend first reviewing the video that covers configuring MIDI OSC Pro. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the device configuration file. So I'll open this in Notepad. Now here, as we've discussed previously, we define the service, which is the address where the OSC data is sent, and we specify a command file. In this case, we are using the MOTU command set, which is defined in the CSV file. Let's take a closer look at that now. I'm going to open this in Excel, so it's a bit clearer to see what this file contains. This file actually defines the various commands which have been set up for the MOTU audio device. So this is arranged in 3 columns. We have the command, transform, and a request. You can see from these entries that we actually have 5 commands defined for the MOTU. So the first one being set slider position. Now, I'm not going to go into further details about how we implement these commands, but basically this command file defines the commands that we can map our MIDI events to. For example, the first command is set slider position. This will set a slider position on the MOTU audio interface. Exactly how these commands are implemented I'll cover in more detail in another video. But for our purposes, here we can see that we have 5 commands available that we can map our MIDI events to. So let's go back to our devices file. Now, the last row we define the map file. This will contain our MIDI map data. So I'm just going to specify a file name, newmap.csv. So I'll save this and then I'll create a new file, which is this new map CSV, and store in the same folder. So now when we launch MIDI OSC Pro, you can see that as it's loading this device configuration, it's loaded the commands for the MOTU and it's loaded this map file. This number here indicates there's currently no mapping set up. Now the way that this map file works is we define various settings. We define what MIDI events to listen for and what action to take when one of those MIDI events is detected. So we do this by defining a number of columns: channel type, controller number, value, action, param 1 and param 2. To understand that more, let's switch over to MIDI OSC Pro and check that this show MIDI events is enabled. Then I'm going to move a slider on my MIDI controller. Here we can see as I move this slider up and down, we can see the events which are arising from the MIDI controller. So as I'm moving this slider, we can see that the controller general purpose slider events are arriving with a value between 0 and 127 on controller number 19. So currently there's no action assigned to this, so there's no request being sent to OSC. So what we need to do to define this mapping is switch to our map file. Let's just rearrange these windows. We want to map this event. So it's channel 1, type controller. The controller number we can see here is 19. And the value is not relevant for this action because what we want to do is set the slider position. So remember, this action corresponds to the commands which we are defined in our command file. Then param 1, which is actually the mixer channel in the audio interface that we want to use, and then param 2 is not used in this case, so we can just leave that empty. So we can save this change in, and then we can switch back to MIDI OSC Pro and we reload the data. This reloads the configuration, and you'll notice here that the map file shows that there's actually 1 MIDI event mapped. So let's just resize this. Let's clear this, and then as I move my slider up and down, you can see that as it detects the specified type and controller number, the value is passed to the set slider action, which sends the request to OSC, and you'll notice that the slider goes up and down as I move my MIDI controller. So we can continue and repeat this process. So we could, for example, set up the other sliders. So let's clear this again. I'll move another slider, the next slider on my MIDI controller. And you'll notice in this case, the controller number is 23. So this identifies it's a different slider. Now, one thing to notice with the MOTU AVB is that there are stereo and mono channels. So my first mixer channel here is actually a stereo channel, which is indicated by these two blue dots. So when we define our next event that we want to handle, let's just copy the row. It's the same channel, it's the same type, but this time it's controller number 23, and also we want to set the slider position, but in this case we want to use mixer channel 3. It's not mixer channel 2 because mixer channel 2 is actually not relevant in this case because we have it as stereo channel for this slider. Again, we can save this change, reload on MIDI OSC Pro, and then we can move both of these sliders up and down. You can see I'm moving them both at the same time. So let's just set up one further event. So the MOTU, you can mute each channel. Now I'd like to set this up with a push button. So if I press a mute button on my MIDI controller, you can see that as I press this, we get a note type event, either note on or note off. And in this case, it's associated with a particular note, which we can see in this value column. To map this to a OSC event, we could map it on the note on or note off event, but for a more responsive experience, let's map it to the note on. So as soon as the button's pressed on the MIDI controller, the OSC event is sent. So let's switch back to our notepad. And in this case, again, we're on MIDI channel 1, but in this case, the type is note on. There's not a controller number, so we leave that blank, but we want to specify to use a note of C#-2. In this case, we set the action to toggle mute state. Again, that refers to the command defined in our command set. And finally, we set the mixer channel. So just as before, we can set this to mixer channel 1, and we can save this, then reload in MIDI OSC Pro. Now when I press the mute button, you'll notice that the audio interface updates accordingly. So we can repeat this process for other sliders and other mute operations, and also the other commands that are defined in our command set. There are additional commands I haven't covered in this example, but they basically use the same principle. So you can just follow this same pattern to apply these other commands to different MIDI controller events. If you need any further information or support, please feel free to contact me and I'd be happy to help.